Hello everyone, and welcome to today's lecture on state segmentation methods. My name is Marta, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Barcelona. Today I'm going to start by introducing you to this idea of hidden states, how do they apply to research questions that we might have in neuroscience, and show you some examples of them. Then I'll give you an introduction on an algorithm, a probabilistic algorithm called either Markov models that can be used to solve some of these research questions. I'll give you a brief math overview of this algorithm, and also I'll show you some applications of this model in neuroscience. Then I will introduce you to this recently proposed method that can be used as an option to the either Markov models in certain applications, called the greedy state boundary search method. Again, I'll give you a brief math overview of this model, and then I will finish by giving you some remarks on cross-validation. So in neuroscience, we know that often our brain might go through different states of activity. And one example of this is while we are sleeping. We know from a lot of research that has been done until now that our brain, while we are sleeping, goes through different stages of activity. And these stages are usually identified by technicians at the hospital when we want to do an experiment. However, we might want to apply an algorithm that can uncover these different states of sleep without the need to use a technician to do it. We also know that a lot of the times our brain might also want to infer states of the world. And an example of this is actually our day-to-day life experiences, because our experiences arrive to us in a continuous manner. Our brain has developed this ability to actually segment these experiences into different discrete units that we usually call events. So, for example, in this example here, in the first images, we see a man washing their dishes, and then afterwards, this same man watching television. So our brain would actually segment all this information into two different events, because they contain usually two different contexts and two different sets of features. So we might also want to develop an algorithm that is able to just take all these experiences and segment them into different events, so then we can compare it with what we expect our brain to do and compare it with some brain patterns. So as I was saying, we might come across with usually two different sets of research questions. In one case, we might want to infer the hidden states that are of activity that our brain might be going through, such as the sleep stages, as I was explaining in the previous slide, or we might want to infer states of the world, as the second example that I was giving you just now about our life experiences, so then we can compare it not only with behavior, but also with our brain activity. So, as you might have realized by now, most of the times when we acquire data, these states are actually hidden for us. Like, we just see a continuous amount of data, and we don't know how is this data segmented into different states. So we can also picture this in this kind of graphical models, where we expect to have a series of different states, and what we can and what we expect to have is some probabilities of jumping between states, here represented by these A probabilities. So we will have probabilities of jumping between the starting state to the first state, probabilities of remaining within the same states, and so on. But most of the time, these transitions between states are hidden because we actually don't know where the states are in our data. What we actually have is a series of observations that we make in our data, and the sequence of transitions between these different observations. So what we have is hidden states and observations. And what we can actually infer pretty easy, usually from our data, is what are the probabilities that a specific observation has been created from a specific state, here represented by probabilities B. So what we wish to do is, based on our observations, infer the possible hidden states. Well-known algorithm that has been applied a lot to do this kind of inferences is called the hidden Markov models. In these models, we assume that the future is independent of the past. And this means that the probability of being in a certain state or jumping into a future state only depends on the state that we are not, and now on the state that we were in the past. We also assume that the probability of observing a certain observation it only depends on a specific state and not in our whole data set and into different types of states. So we will have a series of observations that will be related to a specific state. So usually when we want to apply this kind of models, we face two main questions. The first question is, how can we infer the hidden states given the observed sequence of observations that we have? So given our data, how can we infer the hidden states? And second of all, how can we make sure that we are maximizing the probability and maximizing the probability of having the best parameters that explain the observations that we made in the way that we can then make sure that we are inferring the best sequence of states. So to answer to the first question, we make use of an algorithm called the forward algorithm. So in this algorithm, what we want to do is calculate the probabilities of being in a specific state given our data, here given by this probability called A. This is actually pretty easy to calculate because this probability, which we usually call the posterior probabilities, can be used by applying the Bayes rule, which tells us that the posterior probabilities are given by the likelihood times the prior. Likelihood, in this case, are the probabilities of having a specific observation being caused by a specific state, which again, as I told you before, it's usually a probability that we can easily get from our data. The prior is obtained by summing the dynamics of our system, which is given by a transition probability matrix, which we can start by applying it in a random way or by making some inferences of what we expect our data to be modeled by, times the posterior probability that we calculated in the previous time point. So basically, if we go time point by time point, we can calculate the posterior at each time point, which is the probability of being in a certain state given all the data that we have until that specific time point. And we also multiply this by a normalization factor. But then, if we get the probabilities of being in a specific state given our data, how can we make sure that we are maximizing the parameters to obtain the best explanation of the observations that we have? So the second step, which is called the expectation maximization algorithm, what we want to do is infer the parameters that maximize the likelihood of the data that we have. So this algorithm contains two steps. The first step is called the E step, in which we will estimate the posterior given all the data, now, not just the data until certain time points, with what we call the forward-backward algorithm. So the forward part I already explained you in the previous slide, which gives us these forward probabilities of being in a specific state until a given time point. And then what we do is we kind of smooth out these probabilities by computing the probability of being in a specific state, now giving the whole data and not just the data until the time point we are calculating to. So after we calculate these forward and backward probabilities, we are also able to calculate these probabilities that you can see here below, which are called the single and pairwise marginal probabilities. So these probabilities gives us the probability of being in a certain state giving all the data, and the pairwise probability of being in a certain state I at the following time point after coming from a state J, giving all our data. And why are these single and pairwise marginal probabilities important? Because they allow us then on the second step to actually calculate and compute again a new transition matrix giving these new probabilities that we calculated. So we can compute these new transition probabilities by dividing this first term, which will give us the estimated time spent in state I after being in state J, by the total time spent in state J. So if we do this for each possible transition between states, we can then compute the new transition probability. If we do this in an iteratively way, this algorithm will actually converge into the best set of parameters that will improve the log likelihood of actually observing the observations that we have in our data. And I cannot explain you here like why this algorithm converges into it because I wouldn't have time to show you that. But the truth is, if you want to, this algorithm will, by this manner, make sure that we improve and we end up with the best set of parameters that explain our data. And this way we can infer the best set of states. So as you can imagine, these Markov models are actually pretty powerful. And if we apply these algorithms, we make sure that we will come to a point where we have the best set of explanation of our data, and we will have the best set of states to explain our data. And these algorithms have been applied already in a number of neuroscience papers to answer some of the research questions that I've explained to you previously in the beginning. So, for example, in this paper from Baker et al., in 2014, they used a Markov model to uncover a number of hidden states of brain activity from MEG resting state data. So they came to a point after applying the Markov model where they saw that the states that they had actually uncovered corresponded pretty well to some well-known network brain activity, such as for example the default mode network. So this is an example of how Markov models can be extremely useful in uncovering hidden states of brain activity. The Markov models have also been used in some when we have research questions where we want to uncover and infer hidden states of the world. So here in this paper from my lab that it was published last year, we applied a Markov algorithm, also developed and applied by Baldessano et al. In 2017, but on fMRI data, this time on EEG data. So what we did here was we applied the same experimental design that was applied on the Baldessano paper, where we asked participants to watch a 50-minute movie and then do a free verbal recall of what they have seen in that movie by giving as much details as they could remember of that movie. So you can imagine what happens when we ask participants to do a free verbal recall is that every participant will do it in a different manner. So here, for example, in figure A, you might have a participant X that takes 2 minutes to recall the first event of the movie, and then have a participant Y that will only take a minute and a half, and so on, because some of them might remember some information from one event and others will recall more information or less information from that same event. So when we only have the data and we have this difference between participants, it can be pretty hard to uncover these different events of the world, which in this case would correspond to the scenes in the movie. So what we did was we applied these either Markov models to segment this recall data into different events based on what we expected the patterns of activity to be from the encoding of the movie. And with this, we were able to show that while participants recall the scenes that they had seen in the movie, they do it by evoking the same neural patterns as they do when they are watching the movie. So this is another example on how either Markov models can be used to answer to another research question, which in this case was how are we modeling our experiences of the world, or in this case of a movie, into different states of activity. So as you might got from these examples that I just showed you, the either Markov models are actually a pretty powerful approach to answer some of these research questions that we might have and are currently unusually facing in a lot of neuroscience experiments. However, as you might have also realized from the math explanation that I gave you of these models, they are usually pretty computationally expensive because we need to go through a lot of iterations until we find the parameters that best explain our data. And obviously, usually when we are doing neurophysiological analysis, we have data sets that contain a lot of time points. So this might come with this. If we want to apply an either Markov model, we are facing probably a lot of computationally expensive time, and it will take quite a long time to run the model in our data. So this year, Gerlings et al. Proposed an algorithm that overcomes this computationally expensive problem of the hidden Markovs and can be used to place boundaries in an iterative fashion. However, this model it's not able to identify recurring states, as for example the hidden Markov model that we applied in our data from the paper that I just mentioned in the previous slide. So if we expect to identify recurring states, then we need to go for a either Markov model. Nevertheless, if we wish to look for something like hidden states of the world or of our experiences, we might wish to we might be able to apply this model. This model has only been applied currently in fMRI data, because what they did in their paper was compare their results of this new model with the either Markov model applied by Baldessano in fMRI data. However, they show that this model seems to work much better when there's a bigger amount of noise in our data, and usually when we are working with neurophysiological data, like EEG or MEG, this data contains usually big amounts of noise. So this seems like a promising model to be applied with this kind of data. So now I will go a little bit through the maths of this model that they proposed. But before I do that, it's important to mention that they base some of these maths in this idea and this concept that a state will share a number of features, and then if we are trying to compare different states, obviously. So because of this characteristic of the states, we expect that if we perform correlations within the same state, these correlations will be much higher because a number of features are shared, and we expect the patterns of activity to be much similar within the event than if we compare time points between two different events. So this model is actually pretty easy. We just go through these three main steps. So we start by computing the mean activity patterns over all time points. So here, and here m is actually the number of time points in the specific state that we are trying to infer. Then we compute the correlation between this, between the brain activity at the specific time point with the average activity pattern that we had just calculated in the first step. And here, bear in mind that n is actually the total number of time points in the data. And then we set a boundary at the time point where this correlation was the highest. But let's look a little bit more in detail to these steps. So if we start our calculations in the first step, and here let's set the total number of time points in our data for 100 time points, just as an example. Then the first step, two steps are pretty easy to calculate because we only have one time point. Then if we go on in time, in the second time point, we just need to repeat the same thing, but now we have two different sets of data for two different time points. And then if we keep going along the time points that we have in our data, we are able to draw a correlation representation like the one we have here on the right. So we will have different correlation values for each time point. So then we just need to find the maximum, and that maximum is where we're going to set our boundary. So here's why this model is way less computationally expensive than the Eden-Markov model. So now, instead of restarting the same computations from the beginning of the data, we would just repeat the same three steps, but now we would only do this from where we set the boundary until the end of our data set. So we wouldn't, if the boundary is set, we wouldn't need to infer anything else from the first time point until that time point. So we would repeat the same steps, and again, where we would find the new maximum on the correlation values, we would set a boundary there again, and so on until we reach the end of our data. So as you can see, this model is not only pretty easy to apply, but also because it places the boundaries in this way, it makes it much faster than the Eden-Markov models. But now let's talk about something that I also didn't mention yet when I was talking about the Eden-Markov models, which is how can we actually know what is the best number of states that explains our data if we have no idea a priori of that. So in the Eden-Markov model case, and for example in the one that was applied at Baldessano et al., he applied a method called the within and across correlation method. And now on this new algorithm proposed by Gerlings et al., she applied a different method called the t-distance method. So I will explain you a little bit both of the methods and explain you why this t-distance method also seems to work better than the within and across method. So for both of these methods, the first and the second step are the same. So we start by computing correlations between pairs of time points. And again, keep in mind, as I told you in the beginning, that these models base these kind of correlations and methods in this idea that you expect that within an event the correlation should be highest than across events. So if we compute correlations in pairs of time points, then we divide these correlations into if they correspond to two time points that are within the same event or two time points that are across events. So we will end up with these two different distributions of correlation values, one that corresponds to pairs of time points that are within the same event and another with pairs of time points that are across events. So here's where things differ between the two methods. So the final step, in the within and across method, what we would do is we would take the average of these two distributions and we would take the maximum of the difference between these two averages. So because we expect that the best number of states that explain our data would ideally have the highest difference between within and across correlations, because we expect the within correlations to be much higher than the between correlations if we are obtaining the best states for our data. So we would just run our model for different numbers of events. So for example, from 20 to 200 possible states. And then we would do this computation for each possible number of states, and we would at the end get the best number of states from the one that would have the maximum difference between these two averages. However, then in Gerling's et al, actually they show that this method can be highly sensitive to the within correlation distributions. So it can be biased by that. So what they propose is, instead of taking these averages and the maximum of the difference between the averages, we actually take the whole distributions of the data, and again, we do the same thing for different numbers of possible numbers of steps, states, and we would compute the statistic of these distributions, which is just the distance between the two distributions. And the best number of states that will explain our data is going to be the number of states where this t-distance is maximum. And they show that this method seems to work much better than the within and across method, especially when we add more noise to our data. So it actually ends up applying the divisions between different states, and or as we call it, boundaries, in much more correct way than if we would use the within and across method. So overall, this new model is not only faster than the either Markov model, but also bases this calculation of the best number of states that might explain our data in statistics that work much better than the methods previously applied in the either Markov models. However, actually, if you can still apply a either Markov model, and then if we want to infer the best number of states, we can now choose to use this method proposed by this current paper. Finally, I will just like to give you some brief ideas on cross-validation. So obviously, we expect that our neurophysiological data will always contain a portion of the noise, because these are methods that are quite sensitive to a lot of different kinds of possible noises. So it is important and essential to perform some type of cross-validation to reduce the impact that this noise might have on the estimation of the number of states, as I just mentioned in the previous slide. And there are some widely used methods, like dividing the participants in groups of training and test sets, as you probably already heard in different lectures of this course. And then there's these two other methods that have already been used also in some of the papers that I mentioned here today. One possibility is the leave one out framework, where what we do is we remove one of the participants and we use the average of the other participants to run the model, and then we would repeat this for each leave one out participant, and then we would at the end have the solution for each of these leave one out participants and kind of like compute a distribution, and in this way find out what is the best number of states after repeating all of these. It's kind of like folding our data before applying to the model. And then there's an option where we would just average the data from all our participants before applying the model. This method actually seems to be the one that guarantees us to find the best number of states that might explain our data, because if we're averaging across all participants, we are just probably removing the biggest portion of noise and just maintaining the part of the data that is consistent across participants. But obviously, keep in mind that you could only do this when you expect participants to share the same neural patterns because they are facing the same stimuli. But obviously, if you're running some kind of experiment where participants are facing different stimuli, then you cannot apply this kind of method to it. So overall, during this lecture, I showed you that segmentation models can be useful when we wish to infer states that our brain might be going through. So if we want to answer to this first research question that I mentioned, for example, when I mentioned the sleep stages, but it's also, and it has been applied already, to when we want to actually segment our life experiences, or when we, and this is extreme, for example, in the work that I've done and I've showed you, and in the Baldessara paper with fMRI data, and now with this new method that was proposed by Gerlings. And this is actually pretty important if we want to push for more naturalistic experiments where our data will not be showed in different units, but will actually be a continuous, and we need to somehow discretize these stimuli. I've showed you that the Eden-Markov models are a very powerful tool for model-based analysis, because obviously they allow us to infer these unobserved parameters and states while we are also taking into account the probabilistic nature of not only behavior but also brain activity that we might want to model. They are, however, computationally expensive, so we need to keep this in mind before we apply these models. And obviously they might require some assumptions about the data that we are modeling, because we might need to not only set the initial transition probability matrix, but also like know how many states to expect and try to find. And I've also shown you that currently there seems to be this new approach that it's less computationally expensive. It seems to be more successful in uncovering boundary states in the presence of noise. However, this hasn't been applied yet to neurophysiological data, but precisely because it seems to work better in the presence of noise, it might prove to be specifically more helpful if we are trying to apply these kind of models to answer research questions in neurophysiological data. So finally, here you can find some references of the papers that I've mentioned throughout the lecture. And also, I've left you here some resources if you want to go a little bit through the implementation of the Eden-Markov models. You have some options in Python and in MATLAB, and some other resources if you want to go deeper into the maths behind the Markov models, which obviously I didn't have time to show you all the mathematical derivations of the formulas. And also, if you want to check this last model, you have the paper available here, and you have a GitHub of how to implement this model in Python. So I hope you enjoyed the lecture, and thank you.